The idea behind this was, and who was here yesterday? Professor Umar Qureshi? Yeah? Now, he said some really interesting things. And one of the things that he was talking about was the importance of going back retrospectively and looking at the metaphysical underpinnings of why the classical ulama say what they say. So what do we, because in everything that we, or any kind of fiqh that we address, that there's always a framework that we work from, okay? And that framework may be on the basis of our madhab. So maybe it's Hanafi, Ashari, so there's a school of fiqh, and there's also the school of theology, so it may be Ash'ari, Maturidi, etc. Now, the idea behind this particular presentation is not necessarily to talk about one particular school, but do a comparative thing. Okay, so it's a very comparative thing. And the comparative element to this is very, very important. So the idea was that even though I went through a journey from A to Z in doing this, so I analyzed a lot of text, okay, and this was the fiqh books in Arabic, the fiqh books in Urdu, some of the literature that was out there in English, okay. I also made reference to some of the philosophy that underpins the whole science, and then came to some conclusions and applied that and analyzed it. And then came out with something really interesting. So then I went, so the presentation is a retrospective sort of analysis of this. What that basically means is what I've discovered, I will paste that first, okay, the principles first, and then after that I will give you the reason why they sort of come to that particular conclusion. Okay, so let's start off with the first thing. So this is specific to UK. So the idea is that there's some relevance of the issue of karama or ikram of the body, specifically the mayyit, so the dead body, on the basis of organ transplantation. So there's a couple of factors there that we need to really take into consideration, and there's some journal articles that give us some kind of indication to that. But there is something about the awareness of what is the religious stance towards organ donation, and some of the important things. And the two things that really tend to get highlighted quite regularly, quite frequently, and as you may have sort of picked up from the panel discussion earlier on, was the perception about the body, its dignity, and also the relationship between the person, body, and God. Okay, so this is the main thing that I've basically looked into. The first thing to recognize is we don't have explicit text in the Quran which clearly identifies issues relating to organ donation, okay? And there is very little discourse in the historical Islamic text either. So if you go into the classical kitabs, there's nothing specific about this. And most of the literature related to this is found in books of fiqh, but it's sort of related subjects that sort of give us some kind of indication that can pinpoint certain directions that we can go through to come to some kind of conclusion. So these are the abwab of fiqh. So these are chapters of fiqh such as ritual purity, funeral rites, tahara, and janaza, and even sale of human body parts, which I'll cover in a short while. And also the issue of ikra, compulsion, and darura, and necessity, and the rulings that come under there. So you can see it's been quite a vast amount of reading that was required to do this. Then the other thing is that it's important to understand that the ulama, when they come to their decisions, this is a very important thing for you all to understand, that when the ulama come to decisions, they don't actually just sit there and, well, they're not supposed to just sit there and come out with emotional rhetoric, okay, in making that decision. They have to follow a really clear, fixed principles and guidelines, okay? And it may just be just one small principle and its application, and the final conclusion may be very diverse as a result of this. Okay, and we need to understand that. So even though when ulama sit here and they give their view, reality is that if you go back, they do share similar principles, but they have different thresholds and various other things. And that's what I want to demonstrate here, okay? So, okay, now, bioethical understandings of human dignity. The first thing we need to sort of grasp is this idea that there are different orientation views of the body, okay? So when we look at the idea of the body orientation view. What is the body orientation view? And this view really falls on the basis that it implies an intrinsic value to the physical body. So you will see historically, this particular view was predominant. The idea that we give intrinsic value to the physical body. Okay, so as a result of this, we play around with these ideas of duties to one's own body and its relationship to other bodies, okay? And then it falls onto the idea that the body does not have an instrumental or incidental value, but has an essential value. There's an essential value in the body, okay? This idea then started sort of changing gradually when the idea of dualism came in with Descartes and various other ideas around that, which understood the idea of the soul and the body being two separate entities. So now it was about, there is the person, I, which is the soul, and there is my body. And that particular idea sort of gradually in the Western world sort of led to this person orientation view. Okay? So this was internalized and externalized. Internalized in terms of looking at the body more so from an autonomy viewpoint. So it's about my subjective understanding of what my body is and what I'm allowed to do with my body. And an external approach to that, which led to a more political, socio-political dimension related to politics, such as democracy and various other things, and our own personal rights. And then there was an idea of implying an extrinsic value to the physical body. So there was no intrinsic value in the body, but rather it became an extrinsic value to the physical body. And that was based on respect of persons and autonomy. So the body became instrumental or incidental, but it didn't have essential value. And this is really important to understand, because when we look at the world today, especially those of us who have grown up in the West, we view the body in a person orientation view, even though we may think we don't, we do. Okay? And yet, from an Islamic framework, the body has been always viewed with intrinsic value. So sometimes people have some difficulty trying to grasp this idea that why are we giving so much dignity to the body to that extent? So people get really frustrated about this. Why can I not donate my body organs? You know, whereas everybody else is doing it. You know, why do Muslims, why are they so strict about this idea? Because there is this intrinsic value that exists in the body. And for many, many philosophical reasons, the person orientation view has predominated in the West, okay, in certain locations, in certain regions of the world. But generally speaking, sometimes it gets quite difficult to grasp this idea of a body orientation view. Now, I'm going to focus on the body orientation view because it's specific to Islam and the general framework around Islam. And the body orientation view of human dignity falls on this idea that there is a biological approach to the bodily dignity. And Dr. Podella mentioned this earlier on. The idea of intactness view and the functional view. So the intactness view suggests that any form of physical injury or mutilation or removal of organs. So there's a difference between the intactness view and the functional view, which I'll highlight, which makes it easier to understand. But then there's a functional view which talks about harm to the body in terms of the functional sense, permits invasive procedures and the removal of organs or body parts as long as bodily function is not compromised. Okay? So if I was to put a dead body in front of you, we cannot harm that body in a functional sense. Okay? We cannot violate that body in a functional sense, but we can do it in the intactness sense. Okay? We can mutilate the body. Yeah? We can do things to the body. And also in the intactness sense, there's another understanding of, cosmetics, doing cosmetic surgery, but cosmetic surgery also falls into the objectivity sense as well. But, right, okay, that's one sense, the biological approach to bodily dignity, and the other end to this is the objectification that we've been talking about earlier on. So this is the approach to bodily integrity in terms of the instrumentality view, okay, the body being an instrument, or the fungibility view, which is commodification. So instrumentality view is the treatment of organs or body parts as mere tools or instruments. I'll talk about that in a lot more detail because it's important. Then there's the fungibility view, which is when a person is treated as being replaceable with another similar or identical person or thing. So this is the question of bringing some element of equality with a bodily organ and some kind of monetary sort of compensation, etc. But we'll talk about that in a short while. So it's important that you understand these four concepts. One's related to the biological approach to the body, and then the other approach is the objectification of the body. Now, the idea was, having had all this literature in front of me, looking through that particular lens, I started looking at these fatwa, started looking at some of the fiqh behind this. And what I did was, actually, I didn't do it that way. What I did is I actually looked at the fiqh and all the different issues initially. And then, having read this, I applied this particular lens. So there is a description that we talk about, which is to do with the issues of mutilation, tamthil, so mutilation. So many ulama talk about mutilation. They make, and so do the fuqaha earlier on. Historically, they talk about the issue of mutilation. So this is about anything which is invasive. This is how they describe it. Anything which is invasive, it applies to alive and dead. An interesting question arises about circumcision. Okay, so circumcision, male circumcision in particular, where circumcision doesn't affect us functionally in most cases, but at the end of the day, there is some kind of invasiveness and, in terms of what we're doing. So, but yet we justify that on the basis of the fact that it's a ritual and it follows on from the millah of Ibrahim alayhi salam and so forth, and it's a sunnah of which has been passed down from generation to generation. It's encouraged in males. So this is from the intactness sense, and we'll make reference to this issue of circumcision for a start. The other element that is mentioned is the issue of darar, which is harm, and that is described as the fact that we not to destroy or harm, kill self. Basically, the idea of suicide, no causing harm to any bodily organ, okay? And also recognizing that Islam has many sort of rulings which give us concession. For example, the issue of tayammum. So if there is no water available, yeah, you're in a situation. So the idea is that if water is going to harm you when you're doing ablution, then you have that concession that you just use the dust and you do tayammum. And issues regarding Ramadan. So if you're fasting. Okay, so fasting is basically something which is ordained upon Muslims, but if they're unwell, for that particular same reason, functional reasons, that they are given that concession. So this is the functionality component. Then the rest is more the objectification. And the way it's talked about is تغير خلق الله, so basically, or خلق الله. So this is about changing Allah's creation in how it was originally ordained. So the change of form and purpose is what the reference suggests. The details like I said, in the article, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But generally, what it refers to is maintaining a natural and best mold, not to change this cosmetically, and you cannot use it for other ends. Yeah. So this is the instrumentality view, and then to treat as a commodity. So this is something that should not be. What we talk about, there is what we call mal ghayra mutaqawwam, so there is mal, which is basically not to be treated like a commodity or given a price. A body part has no price. It should not be treated like a commodity. Okay, and this is the fungibility sort of component to objectification. Okay, right, now that we've got this, there are three fundamental cases that you'll find repeated by scholars, okay, when they make reference to the idea of organ donation, and they play a very, very important role, and they made reference to a number of times. So there is one case one which is about eating human flesh. So if you're in the state of ittirar, let me explain what ittirar is. Ittirar is a state where you are really at the end stage of starvation, and if you do not have anything to eat, okay, then you will die. So on that stage, in this particular state, the idea of eating human flesh, okay, if there is dead human flesh in front of you, or there is another person who has just died, okay, can you eat their flesh? Interesting discussion, but it plays an important role, a hypothetical role, in being able to deduce a number of different rulings. So for this reason, the fuqaha discussed this in quite a bit of detail. So that's the first case. And if I align all these different areas in terms of the intactness, sense, functionality, instrumentality, fungibility, you'll see that all of them, well, there are differences of opinion. So if you go down to the bottom where it says permit, these are the 4 Sunni schools. My work is just focused on the Sunni schools, not the Shia schools. Okay? So this is focused on that. And the Shafi'i, okay, the Maliki and the Hanbali, okay? And the Hanbali, they all permit this, okay? And the Hanbali permit only if certainty of survival. So there's a bit higher threshold, okay? But interestingly enough, you find that the Hanafi, okay, they all, generally the ulama there, they prohibit if person is alive. This is for all schools, because it affects the functional component to that individual if that person is alive. But the Hanafi say, even if this individual is dead, and even if you are at that last stage where the only way you can survive is to eat something, even then it would not be permitted for you to eat that flesh. And this is a very, very important point to take. Okay? And my work will demonstrate that this is a particular principle that sits there, and it gets articulated in many, many different ways. But the fundamental point at which it sort of converges is on this particular note. It's the Hanafi school, okay, that take this in this particular way. But anyway, we'll talk about that in more detail later on. The second is the case of dissecting the dead mother to save the neonate. So basically, this is cesarean, okay? So we remember at that particular time when we did not have the technology. Yeah? So at that time, there was no such thing as ultrasound. So you would have to use just your experience and your understanding. A woman who was basically delivering, or she was in late stage of pregnancy, and she died, and you feared for the neonate, okay? Are you allowed to now, basically to do cesarean? On that basis, this question, again, interestingly, all except the intactness, and if you go back to the permit and the prohibit, all schools would allow you to do that. The Hanafi, the Shafi, the Maliki, the Hanbali, only if there is certainty of survival. I'll go into quite a bit of detail in the article. I'm not going to go through that in too much detail. But the interesting thing is, what I worked out, having looked at the Hanbali text, was that Ibn Qudama talks about this element of mutayaqqan. If it has to be, you have to have some element of certainty, and if it's certain that this neonate will survive, then you can violate that particular hurma to be able to achieve this. Case 3, dissecting a dead person who swallows something of value. And this is interesting. If somebody swallows, coins or some kind of monetary, something of monetary value, can you, dissect their abdomen and take this and give it to the owner? Yeah. So this is about impinging on somebody else's monetary right, okay, which is a very important aspect of Islamic law, that we don't impinge on other people's rights, be they monetary. So the idea here, again, follows on that all of them would permit that. Interesting sort of concepts you pick up from this. So where do we have issues? We have issues on this issue with the Hanafi school regarding this idea about objectifying this human body on the basis that you want to eat it, even though you're in this serious state where you're close to death. You are not allowed to do this. Sounds like it's an absoluteness in this rule. So I will explore this in more detail. So this is like a summary. So the dead, all 4 Sunni schools tolerate violation both in the state of ittirar and when competing against value of another's monetary right. But when it comes to the living, the functional integrity for self must not be compromised, and that's important, unless benefit greater than its harm. And then it talks about the idea that the functional integrity of another cannot be compromised, and also there must be some degree of certainty that outcome will be achieved, and only then are you allowed to violate that particular hurma. Okay. Very early. Anyway, okay, so then the issue arises about the objectification of the hurma, okay? And this holds a lot of value. So I'm just going to talk about that, okay? So the bodily objectification looks at 2 particular elements, the form and the use. So the form it relates to invasive procedures, so altering the form or the shape or cosmetic nature. And it talks about the use. So when body is used as a means to an end, okay? So this I will make reference to. And fungibility I will mention when we talk about the monetary sort of component about can you sell organs or not. So here we talk about three things: pure, impure grafts, and human body parts. What does the classical text suggest about that? When it comes to pure grafts, it's permitted if it's pure. So everybody agrees on this. When it comes to animal, it's permissible only if it's something that which can be you can ritually slaughter and eat. Okay? And if it's not ritually slaughtered, and then there's an issue, it has to be dry. Okay? Moist bones, according to some, is not acceptable. To others, it is. And tanning, okay, is another form of drying something to the extent that you can actually use it. When it comes to impure grafts, we were talking about the idea of using xenotransplantation, for example. So here, there are exceptions when the medical need is there. So even using porcine products, if there is a necessity. So it sort of follows on from there. When it comes to human body parts, use of hair of another. So this is human body parts, using another's hair for cosmetic reasons. Okay, that's prohibited. Okay, then you have autotransplantation. There's quite a bit of detail about that. So there's one particular text which talks about the fact that if a person uses his own tooth and implants it back in for cosmetic reasons, it's only going to be for cosmetic reasons. Is that okay for you? Can you do this? Yeah, and there's a difference of opinion even in that. Okay, so this is about. So the conclusion arises: to implant a graft is permissible if it is of benefit. Impure grafts require higher competing need to be permissible. Autotransplantation permitted for even cosmetic need. Okay, and the rule of necessity is not applied as life-saving organ graft was not conceived as being possible or effective. Now, let's just talk about the other element of objectivity, which is the fungibility. Here we talk about two rights: property rights and privacy rights. And there's a big philosophical discussion even in this, and it's quite complex. So the issue is, this is the sort of the more Western philosophical understanding of bodily rights. But from the Islamic viewpoint, how do we play? And just look at the positive rights and the negative rights there. That when you look at the positive rights, which permit individuals to use their body as they wish, but in the confines of Islamic law, okay, and the negative rights, which are in terms of protection and safeguarding self-dignity and not harming. So this is the kind of idea around rights. So how does that play from the Islamic sort of framework? So there's a quite extensive discussion about the sale of human body parts. So there is quite a bit of discussion around this. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you'll see that the conclusion is such that the different schools, the Shafi'i school, the Maliki, and the Hanbali, they permit sale of human body parts, but not any kind of body part. But at that time, body parts were of absolutely no use, okay? Because what were you going to do with a body part that had just died, a person had just died? It was of no value. So if there's no benefit in it, it's not permissible. But when you look at the Hanafi approach, you'll see there's a difference of opinion on that issue. The issue arises about basically breastfeeding milk. Okay, so they compare the idea that breastfed milk, or the milk that is produced, is considered as a body part. Okay, so there's a kind of a comparative understanding of that. And there is a difference of opinion. So it's prohibited. Why human milk permissible? But the question arises, but you would permit human milk use, so you're objectifying human milk, but not flesh. And the idea behind that is that when the human milk, its purpose is to be consumed. That's its actual purpose. It was produced for that reason. So there is no تغير في خلق الله. You're not changing what its purpose was. So it continues from there that the explanation for apparent difference between the human milk and flesh is that using human bodily part is not considered a violation of bodily dignity if the body part is used to serve the same natural purpose created by God. Okay? A lot more detail is in the paper than I've actually put there, but it gives you the main sort of points. And the process of suckling human milk does not violate the intactness hurma of the human body or the functional hurma. So I've even gone through the details of the arguments. One of the best kitabs that I've seen with the most cogent argument is basically in Urdu, Ahsan al-Fatawa. Okay? And that particular kitab talks about it and has quite strong arguments in terms of, and it focuses on this point about the difference between human blood and milk and flesh, and why we can use human blood, even give blood transfusions. Okay, and everybody sort of, most ulama accept the idea of blood transfusions, but yet they won't accept the idea of organ donation, and why that is. But generally speaking, if it's used for the same purpose, that's an essential point. Yeah, it seems to be acceptable. So when you go back to that particular case about a person who's dying, what's he doing when he's eating somebody else's body? He's not using that bodily part for the purpose it was created for. Yeah? It's not to be consumed. But if he was to use that bodily part for a purpose other than that, for the same kind of function, then the sort of dimension changes. Okay, so what this slide generally does is it differentiates between blood, milk, and other organs. You can sort of read that in your own time. But you can see that these are the strong arguments I was talking about. One really talks about the intactness component, the functional, and then the objectification component of that. What this does is this talks about the difference between buying and selling. And we need to recognize the difference between this, and this question arose earlier on. We differentiate between buying and selling. Buying and selling organs are two different things, and the idea of necessity applies here. So there are similarities between selling and donating as well. So when you, there are similarities. What you're doing, you're transferring the ownership in both cases. Okay? The differences are that in a sale, there's an exchange in price, value is fixed, material gain, and there's also associated indemnity. Whereas when it comes to donation, there's an exchange is not being made. There's no fixed price, and there is no material gain. There is a difference between the two. There are ethical differences. Then it comes down to the ownership versus rights. So there's the question of, do we own our body? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala owns our body. What's the issue around that? And there's quite an extensive detail about this, about Allah's rights, hukuk Allah, and also hukuk al-ibad, so the rights of people generally. That plays into the idea of ownership and rights. So on that basis, if somebody out of necessity needed an organ, and the only way they could get an organ is to purchase an organ. For that reason, ulama say, because they're in that particular state, okay, of necessity, then they can. But when you're actually donating an organ, you're not in a state of necessity yourself. So that's where they differentiate on that basis. So what are the limits to the rights of the individual of his body? So this goes on the point of, do we own our bodies, and what's the ruling there? The main issue is that if you say that the right of Allah is, basically the body is the right of Allah, what does that actually mean? That means that you need to see the murad of Allah. You need to see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends through the scripture. And that is basically then observing the Sharia, and you looking at the ideas that are present in the Sharia, such as necessity. And if the necessity informs you, you can, then that is basically within the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. On the second to last statement there, Imam Qarafi, he describes a distinction between individual right and God's right. So it's not simple as something is God's right and this is the individual's right, but there are shared rights. There are things which are shared rights as well. So you can have a shared right. So there's something which is a shared right of Allah and also the individual as well. And when it comes to somebody who dies, okay, then your body belongs to Allah. Okay, and when your body belongs to Allah, okay, you don't have that decision. You don't have that autonomy to make a decision about your body because Allah's rights predominate. So there's a question not just of rights, but also, even if they're shared rights, one predominates the other. Okay, but when you die, Allah's rights predominates the other. But if Allah's rights are such that having observed the framework of the Sharia, it tells you that out of necessity, that you can concede for a higher component, and out of necessity, from the Sharia perspective, that it would be permitted for you within stringent conditions to do this, then that leaves it with just then your right, which was not the predominant right then. So, for example, if I'm going to die, and I turn to my family and I say, look, I want to be buried in this particular grave, okay, I can say that. Okay, it's not conditional on my family to accept that. If they want to bury me somewhere else, they may decide to do this. But I can make that statement. So there is that element of capacity that if Allah has given you the right to basically donate your organ, let's say, for example, out of stringent conditions of necessity, then on that basis, then it leaves you as a person to have that autonomy in terms of whether you want to give your rights, which comes to the point that if you are going to do that, it has to be explicit consent. Okay? Now, this is not my own particular research, but this is a number of ulama have talked about this extensively in detail. Some of it I've presented in the paper. Okay, so consent is a very, very important factor here. Okay, so for that reason, because in essence, there is your own individual right on that basis. And remember, this is not a default position. This is solely out of necessity that an individual would be able to do that. Okay, then I talk a bit about necessity and what that means. And I think because Dr. Asim's mentioned this already, I won't go through this slide. But what I will mention is the threshold of necessity. Okay, so this is Alama Hamwi, who's doing a commentary on Ashbal wa Nadhair, which is a book which basically just demonstrates certain qawaid related rulings related to issues around durura and many other things. But in that commentary, you can see that it's a much more conservative sort of approach to the idea of necessity relative to Imam Shatibi, who basically talks about necessity with less vigor and not as conservatively. Okay, you see that difference in those particular statements. And for this reason, and I've witnessed this for my own self with senior scholars and having had discussions with them, a lot of them make reference to Alama Hamwi, and because I approach mainly Hanafi scholars, I have approached other scholars from different madhahib as well, and they talk about the idea of filhal. The issue has to be such that it has to be a state of ittirar. Ittirar basically means it has to be filhal at this moment in time. If you don't deal with it, this person will die. And in that instance that you will be allowed to do this. Now, when we look at the concept of filhal, my conclusion to this is that filhal is, what that is determining is the idea that there are no variables other than this particular factor, that food will be the only thing that will deal with this issue. And there is a certainty component to this, that if I do give this individual food, that person will survive. That's the whole component of immediacy there. Okay, and I argue my case in the paper, so you can read that. So as long as that's fulfilled, so if you can decide that organ transplantation is something that truly makes a difference to an individual, and there is a high percentage of what we would consider as a cure to their problem, then that would come into the category of, ghalabat al-dhann, which is quite a high level of definitiveness in the outcome. So, conclusion, objectification hurma being absolute. Objectification hurma is not absolute. This is not the case. If the transplant organ is used for the same purpose, then in such situations it can be transplanted in case of necessity. Second point, conservative description of the rule of necessity. So we have a dhurura, okay? So we can decide how conservative we want to be about this issue, but the condition of immediacy serves no other purpose but to assure certainty in the effectiveness as a justification for the use of something which is prohibited. So dissecting cadavers for post-mortem examinations, that's questionable now. We need to think about that very carefully. Okay? So anyway, general acceptance of organ transplantation is likely to lead to serious harms to public interest. So this is another argument, okay, which talks about the issue of mafsada. Okay? So anyway, there's a slippery slope. It's going to lead to all sorts. People, their sensibilities towards mutilating the body will become fractured, and as a result of that, people are more likely to end up playing around with the body in such a way. And for that reason, that's something that needs to be considered in this equation. And the final thing is the explicit consent essential condition. Having looked into this in a bit more in detail, the explicit consent, there are many other variables that could play into this. And I think Sheikh Amin mentioned some of them in terms of the fact that you have the different dars, your government, that makes a decision. So like, for example, in Iran, if the government's made a decision there about this is how they want to treat the idea of organ transplantation in a particular way, so the idea of consent could potentially be overruled in certain instances if there's a serious harm to a large percentage of the community. So I won't go into the details of that, but hopefully, inshallah, that's my addition to that.
So we have space for 3 questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. In your slides, you had mentioned that all 4 main Sunni schools of fiqh actually would permit dissecting a body if someone had ingested something of value, whereas there was that difference of opinion on if you could dissect a body of a dead mother to preserve a neonate. So I guess I had 2 questions. One, revolving on if the value of that item actually has any bearing on the permissibility or impermissibility of it. And then secondarily, routinely in medical school training, we do dissect into cadavers. And so I guess I was trying to figure out the opinion on that as well.
Okay. Now, it's an interesting case, that, because here we're talking about, it's called hukuk al-ibad. So what you're really talking about is there are certain rights that you must preserve of others. So on that basis, that also extends to their monetary rights. Okay, so you can't take somebody's wealth without their permission and so forth. Okay, so these are very, very strict rights. To that extent, when the fuqaha talk about this, they even go as far as see that it's such a heavy violation that they would actually go as far as basically dissect somebody's body and take that monetary amount to give to another. So that shows more the issue of necessity, okay, and it just demonstrates one angle of the use of necessity. So that's what that is demonstrating. How that plays out in the whole equation, if you read the article, you'll get a bit of an idea about that. Just remember what the second question was? Sorry? Oh yeah, for research purposes and for, yeah. Yeah, now I put a big question there, okay? You can only justify something like that if you can demonstrate a good outcome from it, okay? So potentially, and I'm not looking at a bigger scale here, okay? I don't think that enough work has been done in this area at all, okay? But let's say, for example, we can demonstrate that autopsy, okay, post-mortem autopsy, we can actually get some really good information from that has a massive impact, well, a really significant impact on public health. That has to be demonstrated for you to be able to do that. And there's an issue of this. We talk about this quite a lot in the UK. And the ulama there, they have a real issue with the post-mortem. So what they've started doing is using MRI scanners, okay, to do post-mortem scanners. That's become a lot more popular. And it goes back to the point that Sheikh Amin has mentioned earlier on, that one thing we have to really understand about this whole thing is that this is an issue of necessity, okay? For the default position for Muslims is that it's not permissible. Organ transplantation is not permissible, okay? That there is one little door that's been opened, okay? On the basis that it's, we're compelled, if that's the way to describe it. We're compelled to do this. And that's where the door opens. Now, if you're compelled to do something, you don't just carry on walking through this door happily. What you need to do is you need to make sure that there are means and there's a way of working around this to ensure that there are other ways of dealing with this problem. So for Muslims, the body has an intrinsic value, right? And if our body is being used to give to another, it's an act which we should not give much preference to. Okay, and that's a very important thing to understand here. Just the same way as, you know, sort of porcine products in medicine. Yeah, we accept it. You go to an imam and he'll say, yeah, it's permissible for you. The reality is that's not acceptable for us to just carry on taking it for whatever reason. It's important for Muslims to enact something that will ensure that this does not continue happening. You have to remove the darar. You must remove the harm. Okay? So in this case, we should be looking at other technologies that allow us to work around this idea of organ transplantation, which does not involve us having to violate our body in this particular way. Okay? So I'll leave it at that point. Okay,
Thank you.